and welcome to episode 84 of WrestleRotica, the podcast that combines wrestling with erotica. This week we have two stories to share with you. The first story is entitled, Beneath Your Sky. In this story, Taya is frustrated after a recent match. Johnny Mundo helps her burn off some of the attention and frustration. The second story is entitled, Clash. In this story, during the OVW days, Batista is introduced to Victoria, and the two quickly hit it off. Without further ado, let's get to this week's stories. This story is entitled, Beneath Your Sky, and it was written by Archive of Our Own user, Wolfgang von Cemetery. You did fine, baby girl. Taya was pouting. Johnny had told her to rest up, but she insisted on still making his evening tea. Bringing it to him on the lavish silver platter and resting at his feet, even though she was sore and stiff, and so has he come to mention it. In his stubbornness as well, Johnny insisted on staring at his dim laptop screen, even though he didn't much feel like writing. He didn't feel like doing anything. Taya sensed this and held his mug up to his hips. He took a quick sip and dropped his head back. Stop looking at me like that! Smile! You nailed her right in the chest. He took the mug and set it on the table. Taya shrugged and sat at his feet again. Johnny sighed heavily. You'll get Ivelisse again next time. One-on-one. We'll talk to Dario. Taya grinned. Break her in. Oh, is that how you get your jollies? Johnny laughed at his own rhetorical question. He knew exactly what got Taya excited.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
Her obsession with Ivelisse had been pleasurable to him lately too. Stand up! Taya did as she was told and stood statuesque in front of Johnny. He hummed his admiration, reaching his hand up to caress her taut stomach and jutting hip bones. He let his finger linger in the crevices, feeling a sudden burst of new energy. Be naked! Taya was wearing a long graphic tee and little L's, so when she lifted her shirt over her head, she exposed soft breast, with hoarded nipples and perfectly lacy panties. That Johnny had picked out, of course. He tugged gently on the frills and let them slip just a bit, tantalizing low off her hip. She shivered. Johnny fell back on the couch exhausted. Do it yourself! I'm fucking tired! He closed his eyes and turned his head into the couch. Taya sighed because she wasn't surprised. But she grinned. They've both had a long day, hadn't they? She slipped her panties off and stood with her legs parted over the reflective table. She let her eyes flutter, closed, and she was back in the temple. The screams of the audience pounding in her ears, and her feet slamming into that low-ranking bitch's chest. The hit took Ivelisse's breath away, made her disoriented. The lights flickered, and her chest burned. Was her sternum broken? Taya slid onto her chest for the pin, but there was no counting. For a few minutes, even the dust and prime in the air paused. Taya smirked down at her and forcefully grabbed her by the back of her head. She laughed as she slammed Ivelisse's head back down, then drew it up again to her crotch. Ivelisse struggled against the bulging outline of her labia, only digging herself deeper. Taya ran her fingertips up and down her moist lips, pulled gently at her clit. She pressed her fingers on either side and massaged gently, reveling in the texture of her own flesh. Johnny rolled over on the couch, feigning shock. Did I say you could do that here? Taya laughed and moaned in response, but didn't stop. She spread herself wider for show. Oh, look at you! You're a mess! Who's gonna clean this up? He languidly sat up, reached out, and swatted Taya's hands away. He took over, firmly pinching the swollen nub between his fingers. Huh? Who? He pulled gently. I will! Taya gasped. Johnny tugged again, then rolled. Too bad Evilise isn't here. We'd make her clean it up with her tongue. Taya tilted her head and moaned. She felt so exposed, and her skin was so hot that the cool air almost stung. Then we'd lock her up in a little box. No light. Only take her out when we want to play, right? Johnny let his fingers drift lower, pushed them into Taya's warm, soft canal knuckle deep, leaving his thumb to ever so slightly bump against her still, swelling clit. Taya looked down to watch Johnny's fingers sliding in and out of her. She bit her lip. Taya's juices were freely running down Johnny's arm. He lapped his tongue against his flesh. Fortunately for her, we want to play a lot. So many fun games. So much time. She can be a table, a pony, a cat. Anything we want. His arm was tired, but he knew she was close. She squeezed his fingers delightfully, thighs trembling and knees on the verge of buckling. She'll never want to go back to that boring old trios team again. I bet the two of them, with all the toys in the world, couldn't satisfy her half as much as you could, baby girl. When Taya came, it felt like she would never stop. She squirted, juices running down Johnny's arm and her thighs, down to her knees. Johnny caught some of the excess on his fingers and sucked them off. Consider it a belated birthday gift. He winked. She'll be all yours. The end. This story is entitled Clash, and it was written by D. Melza. Wednesday night, show long over. Local watering hole. Usually he didn't join the crowd, but tonight was different. Perhaps it was loneliness, or longing. Aww. He wasn't quite sure what, but it wasn't enough to make him want to join the crowd. He sat in the shadows, nursing a beer, watching. Only a few still remained. Basham, of course. You couldn't expect him to sit on the sidelines. Cena,
the champ, is here!
Constantino, the dog, and the woman. He took another swallow of beer and focused his attention on her. She had only been down at OVW for a month or so, and already she'd made an impact. She was a hard worker, not afraid to take bumps. Her sparkling eyes, long black hair, softly rounded hips. He closed his eyes. "Stop it," he whispered. "Hey, doll, let me buy you a drink." His eyes opened at the overloud, slurred-sounding voice. One of the locals hovered over her, standing way too close. "Lay off," she said, turning her head. "That ain't no way to treat a fan." The lout persisted. "Come on, Queen Victoria. Let your measly subject buy you a drink." From where he sat, he could see the man pushing closer to Victoria, rubbing himself against her lewdly. "I said no!" Victoria repeated calmly. She dug into her pocket and flipped some quarters onto the bar next to her. "Now! Why don't you take yourself off like a good boy and play the jukebox?" "Ah!" the drunkard said, reaching out to close a hand over her hair. "Jukebox isn't warm and willing like you are, though."
"Yeah, not with that attitude."
He bent forward and whispered, none too softly, in her ear. "Can't fuck a jukebox." His feet hit the floor. Basham should be here, looking out for her, but he was off in the corner with some floozy, his back to the room. He prepared to stand, But before he could, Victoria turned toward the man. "Listen, asshole!" she said, and reached down to close her hand over the man's crotch. She squeezed, and the man's eyes got bigger. His mouth opened, and he gasped like a fish out of water. She continued in a steady voice. "If you back away right now, I won't hurt you. If you're not careful, you won't be fucking anything for a while. When I say no, I mean no." With another squeeze, she pushed the man backwards, and he stumbled to the floor, knocking a bar stool over as he fell. The commotion drew the attention of the rest of the patrons, and Basham hurried over to her side. "What happened?" he asked, gazing down at the man, fists clenched. "Nothing," Victoria said, turning away. "Go back to your whore." He sat back, a smile touching his lips. She was fierce. He realized she was the one that had drawn him here, drawn him out of his shell. The drunkard slunk away. Basham returned to the floozy, and he stood from his table and sauntered towards the bar. He picked up the toppled stool and sat down next to her. At his nod, the bartender brought him a beer and another glass of wine for her. She eyed him for a moment, then murmured, "What do you want?" He smiled his enigmatic smile again, his voice a soft drawl. "Nothing. Do you mind if I join you?" She sighed and pulled the wine glass toward her. "I don't need protection, if that's what you mean." "I can see that. I wasn't offering protection, just conversation." Victoria eyed him out of the corner of her eye. Tall, muscular, light gleaming on his shaved head. She noticed him before, and deduced that she should just stay out of his path. No one crossed Leviathan, and from what she'd seen, no one talked to him either. "Conversation?" she asked at last. "You don't strike me as the conversational type." He smiled and cocked his head. "Well, what do I strike you as then? A monster?" She returned the smile and sipped her wine. "Demon of the deep, aren't you?" He said. Large fists closed around the beer glass. "It's living. Kind of like you being the queen." With a snort, she turned her head. "That stops at the arena. Here, I'm just Lisa." "Lisa," he said, turning his head too. "And what about you? Is stop at the arena? Or are you still the mysterious demon?" "Dave," he said softly. She cocked her head to the side and looked at him. "Dave," she repeated. "I thought it was a secret." Nah. He shook his head. JC has this notion that I should practice remaining in character all the time. Says that's what the WWE stars have to do. He's got some notion that will be me someday. "It will be," she said fervently, and then blushed. "I mean, that's what everyone says."
Yes! Yes! Yes!
He shrugged his large shoulders. "Whatever happens, happens. I'm content to stay in the shadows for now." "I've noticed that," she said softly. "Keep to yourself mostly." She gave a nervous laugh. "I thought I wasn't good enough for you." He turned toward her, an intense look on his face. "Not that," he said fiercely. There was an awkward silence, both gazing at one another. At last, she slid from the stool and stood. "Look," she said softly. "I should go before Romeo bulks up for round 2. He nodded and remained on the bar stool. She said as she flipped her hair over her shoulder. She extended her hand. "I'll see you on Saturday." He wiped his hand on the leg of his pants and took hers, holding it firm moment. Yes, you will. St. Teresa's gym was always hot, even in the dead of winter. All those bodies crammed together. Lisa always felt as if the crowd turned into one leering mass of testosterone-driven freaks when the revolution came out. She didn't fear them, but she had to admit that sometimes it made her feel uncomfortable. The setup put them so close, she could almost feel them breathing on her as she stood on the apron. Coming out for a drink after? Doug panted as he tugged Damaja in and joined her in the corner. Damaja walked straight into the massive arm of a Leviathan and slammed back on the canvas. Lisa shivered in spite of the heat. No! Not tonight! The crowd was loud. As Doug shouted into her ear, I promise to keep a better eye out this time. Those lowlifes won't fuck with you. I promise. Her eyes glued to the man she now thought of as Dave. She shouted back, tired, just going home to a nice hot bath.
1, 2, 3. Splish splash, I was taking a bath. Long about a Saturday night.
Doug shrugged. Suit yourself. The match ended with Damaja falling victim to the mighty Demon Bomb. Dave's eyes met Lisa's across the ring as Briscoe counted 3.
1, 2, 3.
It was beginning to sprinkle as Lisa hurried across the parking lot. She hunched over, looking at the ground, and didn't see the figure lurking by her car. Hey! Fuck! She gasped, looking up and raising her arms in defense. Dave blinked at her, undeterred. Spotted you Romeo in the crowd. And I know you don't need protection, but I came anyway. Dear God, Dave, she said, lowering her arms. You startled me. Just like he would have if I didn't get here first, he replied, looking over his shoulder at the man skulking away at the edge of the parking lot. Shit, Lisa said, digging out her keys with shaking hands. Thanks, Dave. I'm not usually so oblivious. I know, he said with a shrug, standing back away from her car. She unlocked the door, then looked up, blinking as the rain fell into her eyes. Actually, I drove over with BJ. He and Damien are heading out for a drink, and I was thinking of just going home. So, if you don't mind. Not at all, she said, shaking off the last of the nervousness. Just tell me where to. He rounded the end of the car, tossed his bag into the back seat, and climbed into the passenger side. Head down Bardstown Road. It's close to the mall. After a few minutes of small talk about the show, they drove in silence, the wipers making a squishing sound on the windshield. Lisa pulled up to a stop and snapped the ignition off. At last Dave said softly, Still lost in thought? Lisa responded vaguely. Unless I miss my guess, this is your place. Oh! She gasped, hand flying to her mouth. It is! She turned to look at him, her blush covered by the dark. I'm sorry! Before she could start the car again, Dave reached over and put his hand over hers on the key. Did you drive here for a reason? No! She said, flustered. It's like you said. I'm still lost in thought. It will take me 5 minutes to drive you back. He inched closer to the edge of his seat, leaning over so that his cheek pressed close to hers. Care to tell me what you were thinking about? She made a strangled sound and shook her head.
No! No!
Was it the same thing I was thinking about, perhaps? The very air in the small car was charged. She whispered, I don't know. I was thinking about black hair fanned out on a pillow, and soft moans that rise to a crescendo. I was thinking about how it's been a long time, and how hungry I've become. His fingers caressed the back of her hand gently. I was thinking about you. Under me. Lisa closed her eyes and sagged back against her seat, barely breathing. Dave continued the caress up her arm, leaning back so that his chest was pressed against hers again. I'm not like that. Low life in the bar, though. So, if this isn't what you were thinking, then tell me now. No hard feelings. I'll get out and walk home. None the wiser. No! She said, her voice a bare whisper. I was thinking that. Not with quite the same flowery language he used. I was thinking of you fucking me. His nose edged along her cheek, breathing in the scent of her. His lips caressed the shell of her air. Fucking, he whispered. Her shaking hands were steadied by his. Clothing removed. Lights kept dim. Soon she was sprawled against the bed. Midnight dark hair fanned out on the pillow. Lips parted. Neck arched up in need. Gently he covered her, fitting the lower half of his body in the cradle of her legs. A large hand smoothed against her brow. Tender lips touched her brow, her cheekbone, and the curve of her neck. Dave, she whispered breathlessly. I'm not porcelain. I won't break. I know, he whispered back. Still, he moved slowly. Gentle hands that bellied the fierceness of his outward exterior. He shifted to the side, one leg still between hers, pinning her to the mattress. His fingers slipped from her face, over the arch of her neck. She gasped when he flicked them across her nipple, and bowed off the bed toward him. He continued down, over the gentle curve of her belly, and teased against the nest of curls at her center. Soft moans.
Ooh.
Her own hands gripped in the covers. He pressed his lips against the taut nipple in a gentle kiss. Dave! God! Please! Her voice trailed away in a gasp when he slid his fingers lower, down to dip in the well of her juices, up to find the nub of her clit. Just as he found it, he opened his mouth, the stud in his tongue pressing against the tip of her breast. Her body stiffened as she worked hard to hold herself back from the full explosion she knew was waiting. For a moment she was frozen, and then, in a flash, a small orgasm rippled through her. So intense was the dual sensation. Slowly, he stroked her with both thumb and forefinger. He opened his mouth wider, taking more of the mound of her breast. Her body stiffened as he worked hard to hold herself back from the full explosion she knew was coming. She concentrated on the feel of him, on the smell of his heightening arousal. She stirred restlessly against the covers, legs widening, silently urging him. When he drew his fingers away, she whimpered. Shh, he soothed, rising up to kneel between her legs. She caught her lower lip between her teeth as she gazed up at him, the fiery sunburst around his navel, the light in the hallway playing over the dragon on his upper arm, his eyes half closed, watching as she studied him. A shiver when her eyes trailed down to the rest of his erection, almost as if she was touching him instead of just looking. It twitched against his belly. Without urging, she raised her knees, spreading herself before him. He moved with liquid grace, guiding himself to her, her gasp caught in her throat as he began to fill her. One hand searched for and found hers, prying it from the covers, gripping it tightly. The other cradled the back of her head. He held himself still, feeling her inner passage flutter around him, adjust to him. The gasp released when he began to move, slowly at first, building up momentum. She wrapped her legs around him, rocking up against him. His lips curved back in a near snarl as the climax neared. Her moans intensified until at last she squeezed his hand, rolled her head back on the pillow, and nearly screamed.
Ah! Ah!
He stilled momentarily, letting the release curse through her, letting her feel it completely. When he sensed her body relaxing, he let go of her hand, prepping himself up over her, and began to slam into her the way he knew she had wanted from the beginning. Deep thrust. His body slapping against hers. His release matched hers in intensity. Powerful hips stilled for the barest moment, filling her with his seed. Then he pumped against her again, slowing until he finally stopped. His brow dipped against hers. Outside, the rain had increased. They heard it against the window. He rolled to the side, slipping out of her, pulling her against him, and wrapping his arms around her. "That was," she said softly. "Amazing," he finished her thought. "Yeah!" She settled back against him, pulled his hand up to rest against her cheek. Her lips pressed against the back of it. They remained curled together, dozing, listening to the rain, touching. After a while, he got up and dressed. He perched on the edge of the bed and pulled her up into his strong arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Next time," he said softly. "Soon," she replied, pushing up to kiss him. Wednesday night. Lisa sat at the bar, nursing a glass of wine. It was the same as usual, the same people. Doug had long since given up on trying to drag her into a game of pool. "Hey, doll, let me buy you a drink." "Listen, asshole," she said, the words dying in her mouth when she turned. He smiled, a lopsided smile at her. "You devil," she whispered softly. "Demon," Dave countered. He reached for her hand. She slipped from the bar stool and took his hand, following him to the door. They slipped out unnoticed. Weeks slipped into months. Dave and Lisa slipped into an easy routine. Wednesdays and Saturdays always. The odd day here and there for good measure. Comfortable. On the outside, nothing was changed. But inside, they both looked forward to their tryst. Rain gave way to sultry heat. Lisa reclined on the bed, filing her nails, while Dave finished up in the shower. She still sucked in her breath when he emerged from her bathroom, naked and faintly gleaming. "That's a pretty picture," he murmured softly, advancing toward her. She smiled up at him and set the nail file aside. "You're not too bad yourself," she said, settling back against the pile of pillows. "Not pretty," he said, climbing up, covering her with his weight. "Oh, I don't know," she said as she reached up to smooth her hands over his bald head. "Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder." He moved forward, lips brushing over hers. "You're good for me, Lise," he said softly. Her response was a moan, followed by a deep kiss. He always started with a kiss. The cool, still-tongued stud sliding over the inside of her mouth. The kiss continued along the curve of her jaw, over her pulse point, down to tease along her clavicle. He made her feel so special, because he took his time this way, exploring her body with delight, as if seeing it, tasting it, for the first time. Her hands cupped the back of his head as he slid lower, and teased at her nipples. So good, Dave," she whispered. Today, he didn't linger, but moved lower, trailing wet kisses down over her belly button. Her legs widened and he settled between them, hands cupping her hips. He ran just the tip of his tongue down her slit. She rested her heels on his shoulders, her fingers still idly playing over the back of his neck. When he closed his mouth over her more firmly, she gasped and her hands fell back onto the bed. The stud, pressed against her clit, always started the fire burning low in the pit of her belly. Wordless moans. It was difficult to keep her eyes open, but she always tried. She was enthralled by the expressions crossing his features. "No, need you, please," she murmured. He raised his head, tongue still pressed against her intimately. She gasped when he winked, and her head fell back against the pillow. As much as she loved the feel of his enormous cock filling her, the times when he pleasured her with his mouth alone brought the most earth-shattering orgasms. Tongue pressed against her perineum, teasing against her ass. Muscles tightened in her belly. Her hands clenched in the coverlet. He moved up, flicking the tight butt of her clit with his tongue. One finger dipped inside of her. He gently nipped at her clit. She arched off the bed. The fire in her belly leaped higher. Another finger joined the first, and another. Not quite the same fullness as his shaft, but coupled with the electric sensation of his tongue, she felt the release nearing, but held it back with an effort. Without breaking the rhythm of fingers and tongue, he groped for her hand, guided it up to her breast. She moaned again, and her fingers teased at her nipple, and that just heightened the overall sensation. 4 fingers now pressed deeply inside her. He pulled back long enough to breathe over her. "Come, Lise! Come for me now!" A hard pinch to her nipple, her head arched back, the cry long and keening as she came. He groaned against her, feeling the wild fluttering around his fingers. Under his tongue, he slipped his fingers out and cupped her against the palm of his hand, letting the orgasm ride out. Slowly, he slid up her body, buried his face in the fragrant mass of her hair, and held her while she came back to earth. Finally, she turned toward him, bent closer, and tasted herself on his lips, and whispered, "Intense." "So I've been told," he said with a smile. She rose up and straddled him, her hands playing up over his chest, down over muscled arms. His eyes narrowed as he gazed up at her pert breast peeking out between the inky blackness of her hair. "Turnabout is fair play," she whispered mischievously. A low groan was the response. She slid down and parted his legs. Smooth. Everything smooth and hairless. A near daily ritual that he kept up. She tongued the smooth globes of his sack while reaching up to close her hand around his erection. She stroked slowly, working the foreskin back. Her tongue trailed lower, over perineum, along the crack of his ass. His hand tightened in her hair, while she continued to stroke along his shaft, peel the foreskin back farther. She pressed her tongue against his opening. He groaned again, his hand still tight in her hair. Her tongue dipped in a little. "Fuck!" he moaned, but made no move to stop her actions. Fully slicking him with saliva, she raised her other hand and slipped a finger inside his ass. His hand dropped away from her hair, and he gripped the coverlet tightly, muscles rippling in his abdomen. She rose up then, took the tip of his cock in her mouth, while she rocked the finger in past tight muscles. As she dipped down lower, the muscles began to relax. Her mouth dipped halfway, then back up again, tongue teasing the rigid head. She rocked her finger, finding the bulge of his prostate. He bucked up slightly, driving a bit deeper into her mouth. She moaned against him. She began to bob her head faster, grazing lightly with her teeth, never quite able to take him all the way down into her throat. Her thumb braced against his sack. She felt the beginning of his release before it exploded into her mouth. His cry filled the room. Warm cum filled her mouth. The muscles of his ass gripped her tightly. She managed to swallow it all. When he regained himself, he gripped her arms and hauled her up. His mouth covered hers fiercely. Arms gripped her tightly. When the tremors left his body, she settled against him, her cheek pressed against his chest, hand cupping his belly. He tucked one arm around her. His hand rested against her ass. "Dave!" she whispered softly. He responded, giving her hip a tight squeeze. "Sleepy?" "No, not yet." "You?" "No!" she said, smiling against his nipple. He was the only man she knew who laid awake after, engaging in sleepy pillow talk. It made her feel warm inside. Aww. Can I ask you a question? He curled down and kissed the top of her head. You know, you can ask me anything, Lise, he murmured. Even a personal question? As long as I reserve the right to ask one in return, he chuckled. She reached down and toyed with the ring around his belly button. Of course! I'll tell you anything! He raised his hand and gathered a strand of her hair, rubbing it through his fingers. What do you want to know? She was silent at first, and at last she whispered, Have you ever been with a man? He squeezed the strand of her hair tightly. Had sex with you mean? She nodded, suddenly shy. He dropped the strand of hair and tipped her chin up, so that they were gazing into each other's eyes. I have.
Oh yeah!
Did you? Her voice trailed off. Did I like it? He asked. She bit her lower lip between her teeth and nodded. He seemed to consider for a moment, then said, Yes, for different reasons, but yes. Emboldened, she slid up so that she faced him, her face on the pillow next to his. How is it different? He seemed to take a moment to consider. There's an urgency, immediacy, brutality that I like. I crave it sometimes, actually. Sometimes the dance in the ring becomes foreplay. A quick fuck after seems like the natural progression of things. And you can't have that immediacy? Brutality, as you call it. With the woman? He smiled. I could, but it isn't what I want all the time. Not even most of the time. With you, I crave the fine balance. Soft and gentle, giving way to baser instincts when the situation warrants. I bet, she said, blushing a little. You could have those things with a man, too. If I wanted, he replied. She moved forward and kissed him softly. What about you? He asked. Have I been with a woman? Her brow arched. Yes! Once! Well, what do you think then? How was it different? He caressed the side of her face with his thumb. Softer, gentler, she whispered. I didn't like it as much. Why not? He pressed his lips against her brow. Because I didn't feel it the same. It was enjoyable, but not something I prefer. They fell into silence then, legs tangled together, drifting into a doze. How long? She whispered at last. Do you think this will last? I think, he said softly, for a very long time. Me too. No boundaries set, no promises made, none needed. The end. Thank you for listening to episode 84 of WrestleRotica. We hope that you enjoyed this week's stories. If you enjoyed this week's stories, please be sure to like, review, and subscribe to us in iTunes. Visit us elsewhere online, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, and as always, our official website, WrestleRoticapod.com. Thank you and have a good week.